All right. Good afternoon, Athens. We're going to go ahead and get started with just some housekeeping items. For the optional assignment, I may not have communicated effectively, and so what I wanted to do is just point out the location for the information for the optional assignment. So if you look on the class homepage, and you scroll down, I actually put it in the announcements. So it says optional assignment, direct consumer genetic testing, and the information is here. I thought that that would make it visible to the class. Obviously I failed and my assumption was incorrect. So I do want to point it out here. And when I get emails, I'm just copying and pasting and sending this back. I just wanted to sort of point that out. And I have a Dropbox already established for this one. So when you go to the Dropbox, you'll see a direct consumer optional assignment Dropbox, where 13 of you have already put in your assignment. So again, I'm sorry that that wasn't as obvious as I thought it would be, but the information is right here. Are there questions regarding that? I should have made that more clear. All right, if not, we'll go ahead and talk about pharmacogenomic applications in breast cancer. So breast cancer is leading the way in pharmacogenomic applications. We have more examples of success here than we do in other cancer types. And so what we're going to look at in this lecture is we're going to review the HER2 targeting monoclonal antibodies and small molecule inhibitors. Now you have these as a first year, but last year I gave an assignment and that required the utilization of this knowledge, and last year's third year class did not remember any of that. So I had to pull up the slides that they had in first year and go through that. So I'm hoping if we just do a little bit of that, this will help. We're also going to talk about the CDK4/6 inhibitors and how those are utilized in breast cancer treatment, and we're going to compare those because now we have three. We'll talk about Mammoprint and Oncotype DX and how those are integrated into patient care. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with one of the more popular examples of pharmacogenomics in cancer care, and that's CYP2D6 and tamoxifen utilization. So with breast cancer pharmacogenomics, this topic explores how individualized therapy can improve clinical outcomes. And here we're obviously talking about both somatic and germline mutations. And we're looking at where these genetic differences occur in cancer. We can have oncogenes in the somatic or germline mutations, tumor suppressor genes, and drug-activating enzymes in the germline mutations. So again, breast cancer is really leading the way for implementing pharmacogenomics into patient care, but the major goal for breast cancer is reducing the risk of recurrence. Why is that the major goal now, as opposed to what it previously would have been? That's because with early stage breast cancers, we can cure these patients. They can go on to live full lives free from breast cancer. Now, some patients, it may come back, and that's again why we want to reduce the risk of recurrence. And so in understanding this theme, you're going to see the genomic tests that are geared towards this goal. They're geared with this goal in mind. How do we get more information for our patients in order to reduce the risk of recurrence? Because we know we can cure a lot of them, and we know the different types that we can and can't cure. So pharmacogenomic biomarkers in drug labels that are relevant to breast cancer treatment obviously include the estrogen receptor and the progesterone receptor. In fact, these are the most important biomarkers. And whether or not a patient, female patient, or even a male patient, because 1 to 2% of all breast cancers occur in men, whether or not they're expressing these is going to dictate how we're going to go about treating them. We also have HER2 expression, also known as ERBB2, so the human epidermal growth factor receptor 2. And then again, lastly, we're going to talk about tamoxifen and CYP2D6. So these biomarkers are involved with what type of breast cancer that patient has. For example, having a HER2 positive breast cancer is the smaller portion of breast cancers. So most women don't express HER2, which is unfortunate because we have lots of great drugs for that receptor. Expensive drugs, but effective drugs. ER positive is the most common type of breast cancer. So the majority of breast cancers are driven by the fact that estrogen is stimulating the growth of breast cancer cells, so malignant cells, and they're doing that through the estrogen receptor. Then we have a small minority of patients that are triple negative. Triple negative, what this means is they do not express estrogen receptor, progesterone receptor, or HER2 receptor. So basically, they don't have any of the biomarkers that we need to target this group of patients with drugs that we know to be effective. And so what do we do? Typically, these patients are going to have chemotherapy, but we'll get into that in a minute. We've discussed this previously. Now, this is a reiterative slide, so if this looks familiar to you, it should. So this is sort of my base slide for non-chemotherapeutics used in breast cancer. So we have the selective estrogen receptor modulators like tamoxifen, tormoxine, and raloxifene. We also have the selective estrogen receptor downregulator fulvestrant. And then we have some of the newer drugs, the targeted cyclin-dependent kinase 4/6 inhibitors. Palbociclib, ribociclib, and abemaciclib. So a lot of these are newer. In fact, abemaciclib was just approved this year in 2018. Then we have aromatase inhibitors, and you guys should remember from first year that if a patient is ER positive, we have the ability to treat these patients with ER hormonal therapy, with a selective estrogen receptor down modulator, or with an aromatase inhibitor. So that should be common knowledge for you guys at this point. I think you've seen this in second year as well. Again, I'm just going over this as a reiterative slide because last year's class didn't seem to have any clue as to how you would treat a patient like that. And then for those patients that expressed HER2 in their tumor samples, pathology says, yep, it's lighting up, they have the estrogen receptor 2. Then we have 3 options in monoclonal antibodies. Again, anything that ends in MAB is a monoclonal antibody. So trastuzumab, or Herceptin, was first in class, first drug to target and inhibit HER2. Then the same drug maker also produced trastuzumab, and tansine, and pertuzumab. So we have 3 different options for monoclonal antibodies. Then we have small molecule inhibitors. These end in NIB. And the 2 small molecule inhibitors listed here that are in black target the inside of HER2 or EGFR. Now, the one I have in gray was just approved, but so far that's only for lung cancer, non-small cell lung cancer. So don't worry about the one that I have grayed out. And then lastly, we have targeted mTOR inhibitor, everolimus, which was first approved in renal cell carcinoma, but now we see this in breast cancer. And so again, this is sort of a reiterative slide just to remind you of what and where these targeted inhibitors are working. So on this slide, we have the HER2 receptor at the top, and remember that the EGFR receptor family has 4 different receptors. So these drugs are targeting the second one, which is HER2. Which is here, HER2. And it's got a dimerize with a family member. And so here it's dimerizing with another partner. It doesn't say if this is EGFR 1 or 3 or 4. But regardless, trastuzumab is here. And trastuzumab is binding to this receptor and preventing it from doing all of the nasty things that it wants to do, like signaling, to grow and proliferate and ignore all of the stop signals. Also, some speculation that it's also sending out signals to the immune system. So this is where monoclonal antibodies are active, right outside the cell, because these things are huge. And then we have the small molecule inhibitors, so like lapatinib. These are going to bind to the inside of the receptor, like EGFR1, EGFR2, and they are going to stimulate pro-apoptotic pathways, inhibit cell cycle arrest, and so forth. Now, if we want to look at the big, broad, overall picture, what I just described to you was lapatinib, which would act here on the receptor tyrosine kinase receptors, or monoclonal antibody inhibitor like trastuzumab that would act here. But in addition to these 2 targets, we have estrogen that goes into the cell, and for estrogen, we have aromatase inhibitors, letrozole and nostrozole, that are going to inhibit the synthesis of estradiol, and we have estrogen receptor modulators like tamoxifen or fulvestrant to actually inhibit the estrogen receptor. So these are all targets you've seen before. One thing that I want to add to the repertoire or your formulary today would be the CDK4/6 inhibitors, ribociclib, palbociclib, and abemaciclib. So these are small molecule inhibitors that are going to inhibit cyclin-dependent kinase 4/6. And this is important because the cell cycle is actually regulated by cyclins and cyclin-dependent kinases coming together. Checkpoints in the cell cycle are regulated by these things, and checkpoint activate phase transition of the cell cycle. So here's the cell cycle, and you would just have an activation and a constant cycling of the cell cycle if you did not have any regulation over your cyclins and your cyclin-dependent kinases. And so these drugs associate with CDK4 and CDK6. And this in turn activates RB. I don't know that all these molecular details are important, but RB and E2F. And so basically that's going to be a go signal for G1 phase of the cell cycle. And then we have a target that we won't go into a lot of detail today, but mTOR inhibitors. So everolimus was approved a couple years ago for use in breast cancer. And so these are all targeted inhibitors, meaning that a patient's tumor would have to express or overexpress these targets in order to receive a prescription for these drugs. Otherwise, there's no rationale behind giving a patient these therapeutics. So if we want to compare the cyclin-dependent kinase 4/6 inhibitors, palbociclib is indicated for hormone receptor positive, so ERPR positive, HER2 negative metastatic breast cancer, in combination with an aromatase inhibitor or fulvestrant. Ribociclib, similar. Estrogen receptor positive, HER2 negative, metastatic breast cancer with an aromatase inhibitor. And then lastly, abemaciclib. Now this is the one that was approved in 2018. It's indicated for ERPR positive, HER2 negative metastatic breast cancer with fulvestrant, or as a monotherapy following progression with endocrine or chemotherapy. So that's a new indication for this class of drugs. So on the next slide, what I'm going to do is show a comparison between these agents. And so for this table, they actually have these in order. And so my pink writing is just describing the order in which they received FDA approval. So palbociclib received it first, and then ribociclib second, and then most recently this year, abemaciclib. But in terms of its activity and its IC50 values, abemaciclib has a stellar profile in comparison to the others in terms of its IC50 and the smaller amounts that are needed to achieve this level of efficacy for inhibiting cyclin-dependent kinase 4 and cyclin-dependent kinase 6. These are all oral, which is a significant advantage, especially treating this population that's used to more oral inhibitors for their endocrine therapy. And then what I have on the bottom is another table from this paper where they're showing the results of the clinical trials, what they were in combination with. So palbociclib with letrozole, ribociclib with letrozole, and abemaciclib with enostrozole or letrozole. And then down here, what I highlighted is the clinical benefit rate. So in this case with palbociclib, it's almost 85%. Here it's about 80% and 79%. But what's interesting is that in comparison to the placebo, when you add these agents, you're seeing a clinical benefit rate that's increasing by at least 10% in all of these cases. And so the efficacy is there. And this is quite different than when we think of treating patients with something like the red devil. So you probably remember this agent and all of the nasty side effects that come with it. Now granted, all drugs have side effects. I'm not suggesting that palbociclib and ribociclib don't have side effects. but they may not be on the scale that this one is, with the discoloration of the urine and the cardiac toxicity and the alopecia and the hand and foot syndrome and the pain and the mucositis and the myelosuppressions and the tiredness and the fatigue and everything that comes with it. Right, these are still some of the most dangerous drugs in the formulary. So how do we get away from these? Of course, this is where pharmacogenomics comes in, and we're really looking at the tumor of cancer patients and seeing what else might be available to target their specific aberrations. And so we have a number of FDA-approved based tests for breast cancer usage in terms of what might benefit a patient. So in the past 5 years, we've had a number of commercialized multi-gene prognostic and predictive tests hit the market. And we're constantly expanding the landscape of breast cancer companion diagnostics. So these tests have a variety of formats. So some might be looking at immunohistochemistry, some might be looking at in situ hybridization, others looking at PCR or even genomic array profiling. And so the one that I'm going to talk about next is MammaPrint by Janvia. This was one of the first, and this is a gene expression assay for use in breast cancer. So this one's interesting because it is a predictive diagnostic test. It's for early stage breast cancer patients that assesses the risk, just the risk, that a tumor will metastasize to other parts of the body. Well, why would that be important? That's important because you're dealing with an early stage breast cancer patient whom you know that you can cure with available therapeutics. So what you're trying to gauge is how harsh or not you need to go with chemotherapy. How many drugs do they need? How often do they need those drugs? And this type of information, if we can get some idea of the aggressive nature or not of that tumor, that would really help in terms of understanding whether that tumor has the propensity or is likely to metastasize. Because we want to avoid recurrence, so we certainly want to avoid metastasis. And then we have another test, Oncotype DX, that previously, it came out first, but it sort of took a back seat to MammaPrint, and the reason is because it had to go through a really, really rigorous 10-year trial showing that it had worth and value to the field. And this was well before pharmacogenomics were embraced as sort of the next generation of how we should be utilizing drugs and how we should be treating our patients. And so they really ran this one through the ringer. But this month, Oncotype DX finally received characterization as a preferred test for chemotherapy treatment decision-making for patients with node-negative early-stage breast cancer. So now they're in the NCCN guidelines. Node-negative obviously means lymph nodes are empty. So it hasn't metastasized yet. So we're dealing with a really early-stage tumor. So how many patients present with early-stage tumors? Actually, a lot of them. Because we have mammography to detect these lesions when they are so tiny, that this is a very common presentation for women. So what is MammaPrint doing? Let's talk about MammaPrint first, and then we're going to talk about Oncotype DX. So MammaPrint is assessing 70 genes using microarrays to determine whether this tumor is at low or high risk for recurrence. So it's taking a specimen of the tissue that's removed, surgery or biopsy, and then the tumor RNA is isolated, and you're running a microRNA. So you're basically trying to see what types of genes are being transcribed and what's being turned on in this tumor and how active is it really. Is it very metabolically active? Is it asleep? These things make a big difference in terms of the aggressive nature of those cells and those tumors and whether or not you're at a high or low risk for recurrence. And with this test, they didn't want to include any ambiguity associated with any sort of intermediate score. You're going to see an intermediate score in Oncotype DX. But in this case, it's just low or it's high. So if you're maybe on the level of one or the other, you're still getting categorized for the group. So it's available for breast cancer patients under 61 years of age, stage 1 or stage 2 disease, with a tumor size less than 5 centimeters and lymph node negative. So with the high risk, this means that a patient has a statistically significant chance that the cancer is going to recur within 5 years. A low risk means that there is a statistically significant chance that her cancer will recur within 5 years. So the greater chance is with the high-risk category. And so that's the type of information that it's giving you. And MammoPrint, of course, as I showed you on the previous slide, is FDA approved and cleared for usage. And so I wanted to look up and see what are these 70 genes that MammoPrint is looking at. And there aren't really genes here that I expected, like P53, MAP kinase, AKT, PI3 kinase signaling pathway, EGFRs. That's not what you see. But this is the hallmarks of cancer, and these are only the 6 hallmarks, not the updated 11 hallmarks. But there are a group of genes that are known to be involved in early embryonic development. And why is that important? Because cancers a lot of times will just utilize those early embryonic genes that tell the cell to grow and divide. Like adult cells aren't doing that, but some of these earlier developmental processes are. And so there's some matrix metalloproteinases in here, TGF-beta, and so forth. So this was just for my curiosity. So I would say for exams, do not memorize this, please. That would be a huge waste of your time. Okay, I think it's very interesting from a scientific standpoint, but other than, wow, that's interesting, like moving on, I don't think there's anything here really for you guys. And so this is what some of the data from MammoPrint would look like in terms of having the prediction of a good score or a poor score. And again, it's based on these 70 genes and where a patient would fall, whether they would fall in this category when you're looking at the genetic expression. So green typically means that the expression is high, red typically means that the expression is off. And so looking to see what sort of pattern their genes that's going on in that tumor fall in, then you can categorize it. Now what's interesting is when they run clinical trials with prognostic tests, you need sort of a placebo or a standard to compare it to, and that's challenging because it's a test, right? It's not a drug. I don't necessarily have a good comparison. And so in this case, they compared it to adjuvant online. And what they're suggesting is that in comparison, MammoPrint significantly decreases the number of high-risk patients. So they're trying to say that their test is more selective, which according to this is the case. But it's just a little bit different when you're trying to run a clinical trial to prove your test versus a clinical trial to prove that your drug works. And then the other test that I want to talk about is Oncotype DX. So Oncotype DX is trying to help clarify the potential benefits of adjuvant chemotherapy for patients at early stage breast cancer. And so with node negative, ER positive breast cancer, so no lymph nodes, estrogen receptor positive, there is a difference between whether or not you are in a lower group where chemotherapy is going to be way more toxic than what you actually need, or if you're in a high group where chemotherapy is going to be toxic, but really in terms of the benefits, you're going to derive more benefits over the long term. But what the challenge was, and what took so long with the study, is that they also had an intermediate group. And for the intermediate group, we couldn't quite understand at first, does this mean they need chemo or they don't need chemo, or how does that process actually work? And so the next couple of slides, we're going to flesh that out and some of the new data that's just recently come out for this question. And this schematic down here just shows when Oncotype DX should be used. So, of course, we have the screening, the mammogram, the diagnosis, which is biopsy and imaging. Then we might have surgery, the lumpectomy and a mastectomy, definitive diagnosis by pathology. And then here is where that testing would come into play before we decide whether or not we want to have chemotherapy for that patient population or not. So should they get these drugs or should they not get these drugs? And hopefully these FDA-approved tests can help make that decision for patients. And so the Oncotype DX assay is measuring 21 genes within a tumor sample. So 16 of these are cancer genes and 5 are control genes. And what they're doing is they're measuring, again, that gene expression activity, looking at how active is that tumor, metabolic genes, processing genes, growth and proliferation genes. Are they asleep? Are they awake? And are they vigorous and vibrant? So the results of the test are reported as a quantitative recurrence score, which is why you see RS on some of these slides. The recurrence score result is going to be between 0 and 100, and it's going to correlate with the likelihood of a woman's chances of having her cancer return and the likeliness that she will benefit from adding chemo to her hormonal therapy. So the test provides additional information to measurements like the tumor size, the grade, and the lymph node status. And so when you look up what exactly is the Oncotype DX gene looking for, what are these 21 genes? So here are your reference genes. If you've worked in a scientific lab, these look very, very common to you because they are reference genes for a lot of different assays. So that just means in order to standardize your plate, sort of like a quality control. So those don't really matter. The ones that matter are the other 16. And so they're looking at proliferation. For example, this is a marker that's used by pathology a lot to assess the proliferation of any tumor specimen, really. They're also looking at the estrogen receptor expression, progesterone receptor expression, so these should look familiar. Invasion, again, we have some matrix metalloproteinases, so these are actually able to digest pieces of cells in order to sort of get through and migrate through and push things out of the way. And then we have HER2 expression. So in terms of Oncotype DX, these genes make a lot more sense than, let's say, MammaPrint, for what it's worth. Then we have the recurrence score. So just to reiterate, if it's less than 10, that's a low risk that the cancer is going to return. An intermediate risk for 11 to 25, and then above 26 and above, this is high risk, meaning there's a high chance that this tumor is going to recur. And so how do these groups correlate with the rate of distance recurrence at 10 years? So here's freedom from distance recurrence. Here's our low risk group, our intermediate risk, and our high risk. So the rate of distant recurrence as a continuous function of the recurrence score, I just arbitrarily said, okay, what about a recurrence score of 30? Which we know is high, but 30, if I look at this line, and this line is the line that's going to tell me what is the chance of a recurrence score in 10 years, that's actually 20%. So that would be high versus, if we have a recurrence score of 10%, which is in the low group, then that recurrence is like, 5%. So that's just the difference, and that's how they measure it. This is not my personal recurrence score, so don't send me cards about me having breast cancer. It's just gonna be weird. I just use this for an example, like I have in other classes, as to what's the risk and what does that look like. Okay, and now I want to just show you a very brief movie about this concept, and this just recently came out.
The 21-gene expression recurrence score provides prognostic information in hormone receptor-positive breast cancer. Research has shown that patients with a recurrence score of more than 25 benefit from the combination of chemotherapy and endocrine therapy, and patients with a recurrence score of less than 11 benefit from endocrine therapy alone. However, the benefit of chemoendocrine therapy for patients with a mid-range recurrence score of 11 to 25, a group that makes up about 2/3 of these patients, remains unclear. In this prospective clinical trial in women with hormone receptor-positive, human epidermal growth factor receptor 2 negative, axillary node negative breast cancer, patients with recurrence scores of less than 11 or greater than 25 received the recommended treatment, and patients with recurrence scores of 11 to 25 were randomized to either endocrine therapy alone or chemoendocrine therapy. The primary endpoint was invasive disease-free survival. For patients with recurrence scores of 11 to 25, endocrine therapy alone was non-inferior to chemoendocrine therapy. 5-year invasive disease-free survival was 92.8% in patients randomized to endocrine therapy alone, and 93.1% in patients randomized to chemoendocrine therapy. Endocrine therapy was likewise non-inferior to chemoendocrine therapy with regard to 5-year overall survival and 9-year invasive disease-free survival. The authors concluded that endocrine therapy alone was non-inferior to chemoendocrine therapy for women with early breast cancer and recurrence scores of 11 to 25. Full trial results are available at nejm.org.
Okay, so what the point of that was to show you results of a very, very long clinical trial for Oncotype DX to try to assess, how helpful is this, and what kind of information is this giving, and what should we do with that intermediate group? Do they get chemo? Do they not get chemo? And I thought this was just a really good way of explaining that the results are like, meh. Don't know if it's better if they're just on endocrine therapy or chemotherapy. So this test did not help elucidate that. So best I can tell is you still have a test that's kind of like MammaPrint, where you have the low patients and the high patients. And then you have this middle group that could really come down to personal beliefs, their physician, or what they want to do, because it's not clear that by choosing either path they're making a wrong decision. All this data really didn't help elucidate that. So the treatment recommendations are for the low group, hormonal therapy only. Chemo was not recommended because of the low benefit and the increased harm, right? We have a lot of side effects from chemotherapy. Those can be very long lasting, and that's what would come out of treating a patient. That would be over-treatment. We don't want to over-treat the patients. Then we have this mid-range where we're not really sure, could be beneficial. Still have like a sort of question mark here. And then we have the high group, and these patients will benefit from chemotherapy. And so they're going to receive hormonal therapy and chemotherapy. All right, last section, we're going to talk about the metabolism of tamoxifen and CYP2D6, and then we'll wrap up, and I will open up a group activity. So 1/3 of patients with ER-positive disease do not respond to tamoxifen. Why is that? When we look at the metabolism of tamoxifen, we see that CYP3A4 and CYP3A5 are instrumental in taking tamoxifen and making it N-desmethyltamoxifen, and then also from 4-hydroxytamoxifen to endoxifen. But we also need CYP2D6 and its isoforms in order to metabolize tamoxifen, because it's not tamoxifen that is actually doing all the work. Tamoxifen undergoes extensive metabolism to several primary and secondary metabolites that have varying pharmacological activity compared with the parent drug. And so it used to be thought that 4-hydroxytamoxifen was the key player having all of the activity, but then other studies showed that the activity of another metabolite, endoxifen, was found to be comparable to 4-hydroxytamoxifen, and also that there was 6-fold higher concentrations than the other metabolite, suggesting that endoxifen is really a key player in this system. So either way, CYP2D6 is required in order to get that efficacy from tamoxifen. And what we see is that, as you guys know, it's highly polymorphic in the population. 58% of lower concentrations of endoxifen were found in those taking inhibitory drugs. And that heterozygotes and homozygotes that had mutations in CYP2D6 had lower concentrations of endoxifen. There are, as you guys also know, a lot of different reported allelic variants. What's interesting is that those who have the wild type, so STAR1, STAR1 allele, and heterozygous women, so STAR1, STAR4 allele, will experience hot flashes. But not everybody experiences hot flashes. But this is one of the signs that the drug is actually working. But again, it's not 100% of patients. But none of the homozygous STAR4, STAR allele women will experience hot flashes. So the experience of hot flashes is a good indication that the drug is working, but if it's not there, you can't assume that there is an issue with CYP2D6 STAR4 allele, and that these patients have reduced or non-functional activity to metabolize tamoxifen. And we have other issues with other types of alleles as well. So here we're trying to break it down and only focus on the CYP4, 2D6 STAR4 allele. And why does this matter? This matters because of clinical relevance and outcomes. So when studies assessed what is the relationship between genotype and disease outcome, patients with the CYP2D6 STAR4 genotype had a shorter time to relapse. and shorter disease-free survival compared to patients with wild type. Now, the overall survival, the study suggested that even though there was a difference here with the mutant allele versus the wild type, that this difference wasn't statistically significant in overall survival. But with relapse-free survival, what they did say is there is a statistical significance between the percentage of patients, in this case, let's say about 45% with the mutant allele, that'll have relapse-free survival, versus about 75% with the wild type. And so in this case, what we're looking at is that those wild type patients have better survival and better clinical outcomes than those with the STAR4 mutant allele. We also have co-administration of drugs that inhibit CYP2D6. So we have a group of extensive metabolizers, so those wild type alleles. We have the intermediate metabolizers that could be wild type given inhibitory drugs, or they could be heterozygotes. And then we have poor metabolizers. These could be homozygotes, or they could be from the heterozygote group, but given inhibitory drugs. And when they looked at 2-year rates for relapse-free survival, what they saw is that in wild type, you had 98% had relapse-free survival, so no issues. The vast majority of them, they did great. Intermediate metabolizers or wild type given inhibitory drugs is 92%, but then all the way down to 68% for those that were poor metabolizers, or if they were heterozygotes given inhibitory drugs. So again, here, the drugs combined with the genotype made a difference on how these patients succeeded 2 years later. And so just a reminder, we have drugs like Prozac and Paxil that are potent inhibitors. So I think that is my last slide for this. Yep. And so what I want to do right now is I have a group activity that I think you can finish up during class time. But we will go ahead and open it up. And so you can work in your pharmacotherapy groups, so you'll be turning in one assignment into the Dropbox folder for this assignment. And so I've just published it, and then in the assignments you have the L21 Dropbox for this case. And so you just read through, and there are some questions to answer about the patient and about the case. And so again, you can work with your groups to answer those questions and turn in one assignment for the whole group with the contributing members' names on the assignment.